So hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today's tutorial is going to be a really fun one. What we're going to do is we're going to create a clone of Layouts by Instagram. Of course, the clone app we're creating today is going to be quite a bit simpler than Layouts by Instagram. They have a lot more layouts, for example. The reason is because it's quite a lot of effort just to make one layout. So I'm going to show you one layout and you should be able to take that information and extrapolate it into as many new ones as you want to make. That being said, there's a lot of cool principles. We get to do things with the Expo file system. We get to build a photo editor with React Native Skia, and I think you're really going to enjoy it. And as you can see, there's a demo of this playing off to the side. So something that was a little bit weird and unfortunate is that while I was recording this video, Instagram actually took Layouts by Instagram down, so you can't download it at the moment. Thing is, though, the sort of collage app type genre is quite big, and you can take the principles that you learn here and use them and implement them in order to build your own collage style app. All right, guys, so as always, the solution is down in the description below, and I hope you'll like and subscribe. Let's get started. So to begin, what we're going to do is create a blank Expo app, and we're going to do that using npx create expo app at latest dash dash template. Under templates, I'm going to pick the blank TypeScript option because I want to set up all the libraries myself so that we can use things that I'm a little more comfortable with. We're going to call this app the collage app, and then I'm going to let this install, and when it's done, I will jump back. So now that the app is fully ready and the project's ready for us to make some modifications, the first thing I'm going to do is install our libraries. And I'm going to do this right away so that I don't have to interrupt the tutorial to do this later on. Some of these, it's obviously why we need them. Expo Asset, Expo Image, File System, Media Library. These four are all to do with basically grabbing the images from the file system and being able to do different things with them on the screen. Expo Blur is just for fun. It's used for a fun scrolling blur effect that I'll show you later. And build properties is so that I can configure some things in the app.json. You'll see that a little bit later on. Here we have our standard software management suite of libraries that are in pretty much every project you'll ever make. Gesture handler, reanimated, and safe area context. We'll need these for the photo editor later on, and also to keep the padding from going under the top bar. I use React Native Share here because it's more flexible than the native React Native Share, like the one that Meta makes. It's also more flexible than Expo's version. I think React Native Share is probably the best share library right now. And that's the nice thing about Expo, right? You don't necessarily have to use their libraries. If there's another option that you feel is better, you can select that. And in this case, I think React Native Share is kind of the better way to go. So you'll notice next, I'm using React Navigation. If you want, you can use Expo Router as well. I have no real strong opinion about which one you want to use. The reason I'm using React Navigation is because it's what I'm more comfortable with. It's what I use in my everyday work. And so for me, it's just easier to use React Navigation than it is for Expo Router. This is also a really small project as well. So we wouldn't gain much from having a folder-based routing structure. In this case, it wouldn't mean much. Finally, it wouldn't be a Dan's React Native Lab video without React Native Skia. We're of course going to use this to build the photo editor as we go through the project. All right, so let's install these and I'll come back when they're all finished. Now that we have all of our libraries set up and installed, the last thing we need to do is go into our app.json and configure some of the config plugins that we used. And as you can see, they're already kind of marked off here. The first one being Expo Asset. So inside of Expo Asset, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an assets directory. And this is going to be under /src/assets. And let me check if that already exists. It probably doesn't because I don't have an SRC library. And then under here, I'm going to create a folder called assets. So any images that I have, they're all going to go in this folder. And Expo Assets is going to be smart enough to go there to grab them. And whoops, that's also supposed to be an array. So let's make that an array. And we should be all set. Next, we have Expo build properties. This one doesn't need to be in here. I'm not sure why it was added. For React Native Share, I'm just going to copy and paste this from my finished project, and I recommend you do that as well. This is just like a base configuration for React Native Share that allows you to share to a bunch of popular sites like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. There's no reason to go too deeply into the logic of this. There isn't much to gain. Finally, the last one is Expo Media Library. This one as well doesn't require much explanation. Again, I recommend you just copy paste it from my project. I promise we'll get into some real coding soon, guys. But we do have to configure things before we get started. But what you can do is customize this message. I did not customize this message. I took this straight from the Expo Media Library website page and I used it directly. So I recommend you do the same. Just copy paste this. Nothing here really needs to be configured too deeply. Finally, once you're done that, run npx expo prebuild. That should give you your iOS and Android folders. And after that, we should be ready to go. Now that we have our basic library set up, what we're going to do is we're just going to set up the navigation structure really quickly. Like I said, this app is really simple to navigate through. It only really has 2 screens, so it won't really take much effort to get all that done. Really quickly though, I just added some icons to the app that'll be used later on. I pulled them from Noun Project. This one was from Layouts by Instagram, but yeah, we're going to be using these later on. I didn't think it needed to show you guys copy pasting into a folder, so I skipped that part. But these are included, of course, in the solution if you want to take these icons and use them yourself. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to set up the screen structure. And to do that, inside of source, I'm going to create a new folder. Actually, I'm going to create a couple. The first one's going to be home. The second one's going to be editor. And inside of editor, I'm going to put editor.tsx. And inside of home, I'm going to put home.tsx. And inside of here, I'm just going to create really basic components that do pretty much nothing because I'm just setting up navigation right now. And then we're going to center it. And I'm going to call this one home. And then I'm going to do the same thing in editor. But I'm going to call this one editor. And do that. Okay, so back in the app.tsx, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a navigator. And then I'm going to wrap it with a few different contexts. So to do that, we're going to create a root stack. And what we're going to do is we're going to import create native stack navigator from at React Navigation / native stack. All right, so now that we have that, inside of here, we're going to add our screens property. First one's going to be home. The screen for that is the home component we just created. And then in the options, we're going to do header shown false because I don't want a header in this app. I'm going to do the same thing for editor. Inside of editor, the screen for editor is the editor screen. And for the options, whoops, I'm going to make header shown false. Okay, so now that I have this configuration, I can create my navigation with the static navigator and throw my root stack configuration into it. And this gives me the navigation that I'm going to need for my app. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to basically return my navigation here. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap it with a few different things. The first is going to be the safe area provider. This is so that I can use the React Native safe area insets. That's going to come in handy a little bit later on. I'm also going to wrap this in my gesture handler root view because that's another thing we're going to need a little bit later on. And inside of navigation, I'm going to hide the Android status bar because I don't think we're going to need that at all. Okay, so at this point, really quickly, I'm going to just make sure our navigation works. So it's going to start on the home screen. I'm going to create a quick button and see if I can navigate to the editor. And I'm just going to any type navigation. This app only has 2 screens, like I said, so I don't think I need to create a big complex TypeScript structure for navigating. But everything else in this app will be very much strongly typed. Okay, so let's quickly see if that worked. I'm going to compile, and I'll be back when it's all done and ready. Okay, guys, so I compiled and I got this error unimplemented component rn screen stack. The reason is because I forgot to install React Native Screens. If you compiled up to this point, you're probably going to end up with the same error. So please install this, and this should fix all of your problems. I'll be right back after I first run this, wait till it finishes installing. Then when it's done installing, I'm going to run pre-build one more time, and that should get us where we need to be. All right, after that interlude, you can see that the app did compile, and I made one more tiny mistake, but should be easy to fix. If I just add a quick flex 1 to both of these, I should be able to see the buttons. And you see home's in the middle. And let's see if I click home. You see that home loads up really nicely, which is awesome. Okay, now we're ready to start writing the real code, and the project setup is complete. So now that the project setup's done and we're on the home screen, what we're going to do is start creating this grid you see here that's underneath this top thing. I want to do the grid first because kind of the entire screen is sort of built around it and all the nice effects that we want to do. And I'm going to start by converting this to a fragment, and we're going to throw a flat list inside of it. For now, I'm just going to use mock data. Actually getting the images from the phone is a little complicated, so we're going to do one thing at a time, and we're going to focus on layout. So on the flat list, the data is going to be equal to the data above, and the render item is going to return a view with a text in it, and that text is just going to be the item. And as you can see, that displays up there, just like you'd expect. Let's create some styles now that we can use in order to actually style this. Did I import style sheet? I did not. Okay. And the first of these is, of course, going to be the container. The container is going to have a flex of 1, and its background color is going to be black. So we'll say style is styles.container. As you can see, we get that nice black background that we want there. So I'm going to build a lot of these components in line, and then I'm probably going to move them out to files of their own, just because it makes things a little easier to read and to work with. But to start, what we want to do is we want to have 4 squares that kind of are evenly spaced across the width of the screen. And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to start by setting the number of columns to 4. And yeah, okay, that's going to yell at us. That's fine. And then what we're going to do is we're going to style our view. So I'm going to get something really quick from this. I'm going to make the background color of these things alternate. So if the index is, or sorry, the modulus of the index is 0, I'm going to make it red, otherwise I'm going to make it yellow. And of course, everything's kind of crammed off into the side like that, which is super weird. And if you remember, we wanted everything to fit evenly into the width and height, sorry, the width of the screen. And so to get the width of the screen, I'm going to get the dimensions of the window. And I'm going to say that the width of each of these is going to be the width of the screen divided by 4. And I'm going to do the same for the height as well. All right, and then I can make this alternate a little differently just because you can see it's different cubes or give it a border or whatever. But of course, as you can see, our list is starting to kind of take shape here. The next thing that I want to do is create that nice blurred header that we had at the top with the Layouts by Instagram logo. You can't see this, but on iOS, if you scroll under it, it actually blurs, which is a really cool effect. And I kind of want to do that next because I think that it is a big part of the screen's layout. The way we're going to do that is we are going to start by, under the flat list, creating a blur view. And inside this blur view, I'm going to give it an intensity of 90. That's just a number I thought looked cool. You can make it whatever you want. I'm going to make the tint dark because this is kind of a like darker app. And then we'll give it a style in a second here. So the style of this container, it's going to have a width, which is equal to the width of the screen. It is going to have a height, which I'm going to set to 150, but I'm going to put that in a constant in just a second because I don't want it just out there like that. And I'm going to make it justify its contents and align its items to the center. What I'm going to do at this stage is inside of source, I'm going to create a new directory and I'm going to call it components. In here, I'm going to put some different reusable components as we go. But for now, I'm also going to put some constants in here that I'm going to be using for UI. And this constant is going to be the blur container height. And I'm going to export it from here so that I can pull it in this file. And there we go. Okay, so far, we're not seeing anything really blur, right? The reason we don't see the blur is, of course, because we didn't apply it. Okay, so let's save, and also we need to reload. And as you can see, there is like a grayish effect here. And actually, this is because it's sort of trying to blur, but it can't because of how things are laid out. And the reason is because we need to absolute position the background. Absolute positioning the background will allow the blur to sort of overlay the content instead of having the blur become part of the rest of the flexbox spacing. So I'm going to create a new style here. I'm going to call it background. Inside of background, I'm going to take the style sheet absolute fill object, and I'm going to add a couple properties to it. I'm going to give it flex 1 so it fills the screen. I'm going to give it a background color as well. So what I'm going to do in my constants file is I'm going to create a constants variable for colors. And my first one's going to be background, and that's going to be the one I use. I'm creating this colors file just so I can have a little bit of consistency as we move through the app, and I don't have to keep retyping the colors again and again and again. Okay, so let's apply this background this background style to the flat list. And if I reload, as you can see, we're starting to get that nice blur effect, which is really cool. All right, so at this point, the blur container height's looking a little small to me, so I'm going to increase that to about 300, which is a little better. And inside the blur view, I'm going to put an image view that has our nice layouts by Instagram icon. And the source is going to be assets/layouts.png because that's the name of the image. I'm going to make the resize mode equal to cover because I think that usually is the best looking one. And I'm going to style it so that we have a height of 150 and a width of 150. And now as you can see, it's starting to look a little better, right? So the next step that we have to do is maybe a little unexpected, but we're basically going to use a view, and then the view is going to push all this content down here so that when we scroll, we kind of scroll up within that space. And we can use the list header component property from flatlist in order to do this. So we're going to have a view, and we're going to style it. So width is going to be 100%, and then its height is going to be equal to the height of the blur view container. And now as you can see, it pushes things down, and as we scroll up, they blur really nicely under the blur view just like this, which is really cool. So at this point, we're almost at the point where we can start doing the images and the business logic. But what I want to do is I want to just make a couple final UI tweaks first so that we can focus the next section on just the logic it takes to display the photos and select them, and so that we don't have to worry about sort of rejigging this whole thing as we do that. So what I'm going to do is within home, I'm going to create a components folder here. And before I go on, let me explain why I'm doing this. Normally you have component folders at different levels, and the component folder closest to the you want to keep your components as close as you can to the screen that's using it. So if a component's only being used by home, I keep the components folder in home. But as soon as a component or I guess in this case a constant, is needed in more than one place, home and edit, that's when I lift it to this level here. But because these components are only going to be used within the context of home, I'm just going to be making it within home. So this first file is going to be called image placeholder because it's going to be where we hold the image. And here I'm going to need the image from React Native. I'm going to have an interface that's going to take in an item. Eventually, this is going to be like a base 64 that we can use to display the image, but for now, it's just going to accept nothing because I'm just doing layout stuff. And in here, I'm going to return an image, but the image is going to take on these properties here. And we also, of course, need to get the width from the dimensions again. And then after that, I'm going to take the resize mode as well that I used for this image here. But you can also put it in the JavaScript part. So actually I'm going to do that. And then finally what we need is a source. And eventually this source is going to be the item here that we pass in. But for now, because we don't really have anything, I am going to just steal an image from the layouts, and I'm going to use that and just project that everywhere. Again, eventually this item is going to be passed into here, and that's going to display the image. But because we don't have that right now, that's not how I'm going to do this. Okay, so within here, let's create a fragment. And I'm going to throw the image placeholder in there. And the image placeholder has an item, and I'll just leave that blank. Okay, so as you can see, our images are all evenly sized. They all fit within the squares. And what I'm going to do next is I'm going to create an overlay that can show when these are actually selected. So for this next section, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an overlay that puts a border around each of these images. This is going to be used later on to represent the selected state. So like whether you clicked on an image or something like that and it's active in the template. I understand that this could be done with just a border, but I know some people like to add checkboxes and different fancy things like that to the overlay. I wanted to keep that option open to people, and so I made it a transparent box that you put over each image instead. Of course, feel free to customize that on your own if you like. So in the components folder then for home, I'm going to create a new file called image overlay. And so inside here, just like before, I'm going to need view and dimensions from React Native. First thing up the top, I'm going to get the width again because I know I'm going to need it. I'm now going to define an interface. This is going to take in two different values. The first is going to be the selected index, or sorry, the selected items. So all the items that are selected in the array of items. For now, this doesn't really have much significance. And the index, I'm sorry, is going to be the current item. So the item that you currently are in the list. As I said, right now, this doesn't have a lot of significance. We haven't done anything with this yet. I'm trying to keep the business logic part kind of separated from the UI part. So for now, just accept that this will be the case and don't worry too much about how this is going to be used in the near future. So let's create the component. And that, of course, is going to take the selected items and the index. And then what it's going to do is it's going to return a view. And this view is going to have quite a lot of styles in it. So its height and width are going to be width divided by 4 because we want each of these items to be perfect squares. I think that part's fairly self-explanatory. Next thing we're going to do is give a transparent background color because we want everything to be transparent except for the border or if you're overlaying something, whatever it is you're overlaying. At this point, I'm going to do up at the top, out at the bottom here actually, style sheet so that we have all the absolute positioning. The opacity is going to be 1 of this. And now the border width of this thing is going to depend on whether in all of the items we've selected so far, the index is included in them. If the index is included, so this item's selected, we're going to give it a border of 3, otherwise 0. And for border color, we're going to do basically the same thing. We're going to say if it is selected, we're going to do light blue. Otherwise, we're going to do transparent. For now, though, just so that this always shows up so I can test that it all worked, I'm just going to make them both do the same thing. Now back in home, I'm going to put my image overlay here. And I'm just going to make selected items empty. And then I'm going to make index equal to 0 because right now it doesn't really matter. And as you can see, a couple of our items are highlighted. So the reason that only 2 of these are highlighted is because fragments are kind of weird when it comes to borders. We're going to need a pressable later anyway, so I'm just going to wrap this with a pressable. And as you can see, everything's wrapped with a border. So I'm going to put the logic back for now because you're going to see it in action a little later on. All right, so one last thing we got to do, and then we can move on to business logic. I'm going to make a list empty component so that when there's no data in the list, it's going to just show a loader instead of showing a bunch of empty stuff, kind of like what we have now. I'm going to put an activity indicator. It's going to have a large size. And then its style is going to be, again, the style sheet.absoluteFill object. I'm going to justify my content in the center. I'm also going to align items in the center. Then for the top part of this, it's maybe a little more complex. We're going to make that the height divided by 2. So that's the middle of the screen, like the actual middle of the screen. But then what we're going to do is we're going to add to this the blur content container height and divide that by 2. The reason we do that is because the blur content container pushes it down maybe a little past halfway. And so we need to pull things back up so that they're closer to where the middle is. So now if I make data empty, I should hopefully see that. And I do. So basically this loader is going to show in the middle of the empty space until there's data. Then as soon as there's data, this whole thing's going to populate. So let's get some images actually showing in these squares instead of just these placeholders that I put here. If you remember earlier, I discussed about scope and where you actually put components in the folder structure. The same thing applies to hooks and not just components. So I need a hook that manages the state for this screen, like whether an image is clicked and what the images are and things like that, but it's only needed in home. So I'm going to create a new folder under home called hooks. And in here, I'm going to create a new hook called use photos. Now inside of use photos, the first thing we need is the permissions. We're going to have the result of the permission response and a method that requests the permission. This is going to be from use permissions from Expo Media Library. Under here, we're going to have the album photos, which is all the photos from the phone's album. So it's going to be album photos and set album photos. And that's going to be a state. And of course, that state is going to be a string array. So why a string array, right? That seems like a weird choice for photos. The reason is because when photos are encoded into a format that can be used on the JavaScript side, they're in base 64. So an image can take in a base 64. An image React Native component can take in a base 64 that represents an image and then show the image to the screen. And that's the approach that we're going to be using here. So in the end, we're going to be returning the album photos. So I'll make sure that's in the return. We're going to be slowly building this up as we go along, but for now, this is the only one we need to export. Anyways, let's write a function that can actually get the photos. Let's go to async function, get photos. Inside of here, we're going to say if the permission response is not equal to granted, what we're going to do is we are going to request the permissions. And it doesn't like that because I didn't check the status. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to say const all photos assets is going to be equal to await get assets async. And in here, we're going to say the media type is equal to photo. So now we're going to get our base 64 data, which is going to be a string array. Which is going to be a string array. And what we're going to do is we're going to loop through all of the photo assets and put these into the array. So we're going to say for photo asset of all photo assets dot assets, we're going to get the info for that. And that comes from get asset info async from Expo media library. So it's going to get the information for the photo from here, which the only thing we really need in the info is just the URI for the image because it's not given to us directly, but get info async will give it to us directly. We next want to get the base 64, which we can get from read as string async, which comes from the Expo file system. And we know it's going to exist, so I'm going to use the bang operator here. And we want the Expo library to give us this image back in base 64 format. So at this point, we've grabbed all of the image assets. We've grabbed the information for those assets. And on that information, we use the local URI in order to get a base 64 encoding of the image. What we're going to do now is in base 64 data, we are going to push the base 64. And at this point, we can just set the album photos to the base 64 data. Okay, so back in the home screen, is we're going to grab that from use photos. And then the album photos, we're going to get rid of data. And then we're going to replace data with album photos. And then what we're going to do is we're actually going to pass in the correct information here. So the item is now going to be the base 64 value. The index is going to be the index here. We don't have selected items yet, so we don't have to worry about that right now. But this should hopefully allow us to kind of get these things to work on live reload. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a use effect so that right when the app loads, it's going to try to get the photos. And if I save, let's see if it'll request, and it does. I'm just going to allow full access, and whoops, we're still seeing these placeholders, but that's easy to fix. The reason it didn't work is because we didn't actually pass the image here into the image in image placeholder. So let's do that. So we go under source. We make the URI equal to a very special value. I'm going to copy and paste this from the result because it's not like, it's kind of something you have to memorize. But you see this data image PNG base 64? That has to prefix the base 64 value so that React Native knows how to interpret it. If I passed in the base 64 directly, it probably wouldn't work or do something glitchy. So you got to remember when you're using base 64 and you're passing it into an image, you have to start it with this prefix. So if I save now, as you can see, we have all of our images and they blur nicely under the blur view. All right, guys, so before we start into the coding for the next section, what I want to do first is go over sort of conceptually what we're doing in a little whiteboarding exercise. There's a lot of like state management stuff going on, and I don't think this is going to be understandable unless we kind of explain it all. So there's three big pieces of state that we're going to go through, and the first of these is selected items. And selected items is the index of the items you've selected in the flat list. And let me draw this really quick. So let's say we have our app here, and inside the app, we have a few sections on this grid, right? I know there's 4, but I'm trying to go a little fast here. So each of these are sort of indexed this way, and we need an array to keep track of which ones we've clicked on. So let's say we've clicked on 0 and 5 and 7. Our array would look like this: 0, 5, 7. Okay, so that's selected items. There's going to be another variable called selected images. And selected images is a base 64 representation of the images that you've selected so far. So if we go back here and we have items 0, 5, and 7, we also have another array of the all images, which we created earlier. This is just all the images from your phone. And there's like a first image and like a second image. And it kind of just goes on so far and so forth until like the nth image, whatever that is. But basically what happens is we take these images, and then the selected images, that becomes the image at 0, the image at 5, and the image at 7. But of course, it's the image converted in a base 64 format. Finally, the last piece of state that we have is probably the easiest to understand, which is these Skia images. And all this is basically the selected images, but they are converted from a base 64 into a Skia image. And that's basically everything you need to know in terms of state. Let's jump in and code this out. Okay, so now that I just explained that, I'm going to quickly add in those states that we need. The first is going to, of course, be, like we mentioned earlier, the selected images. And then that's going to have a string array as its value. Next, I'm going to do selected items. And because I said earlier, this is going to be an index, I'm going to make this into a number array. And it's also going to be empty at the start. Finally, we're going to have the Skia images. And that's going to be a Skia image array that starts as empty. Okay, so the next thing that I'm going to do actually is just export these. So selected images, selected items, Skia images, selected items, and Skia images, because we're going to need them all in the UI at some point. We're also going to need the method onItemSelected. And this is going to be called whenever you select an item from the list. The index, of course, is the index of the item that you just selected. So let's have a look into what insertion will look like. And basically what we're going to do is we're going to say if the selected items.length is less than 3, we're going to add, less than 3, but also it hasn't already been duplicated. So if it includes the index or it doesn't include the index, then we want to do an insertion. We limit to 3 because our template today only is going to have 3 items that you can put in it. And this include statement just basically says, if you've already selected the item, don't allow the user to select the second one. So just as we talked about in the whiteboarding session to the selected items, we're going to need to add the old selected items and the new index at the end. And for the selected images, we're going to add in the selected images, and then at the end, we're going to add the image at the album photos at index, just as we discussed a little bit earlier. So to add the Skia images, it's a little bit quirky. We're going to have to use a use effect here because you have to do some kind of special stuff to make the base 64 encodings into a Skia image. So we're going to say use effect. And in here, we're going to refresh whenever the selected images changes. And so we're going to say is if the selected images dot length is greater than 0, What we're going to do is create an array of all the images. And then we're going to go through all the images, and we're going to say for every selected image of these selected images, we're first going to create the Skia data from the base64. So we're going to say skia.data. I got to import it, I guess. Skia.data.from base64 takes in the selected image. The image is then converted to an image by doing skia.image.make image from encoded. And in here we put the data in. And actually I'm just going to use the bang operator here because I'm sure these are going to be present and I don't want to add a bunch of null checks. Finally, we're going to push those images into the array. And then the last thing we're going to do at the end of this, just before the end of the if, is we're going to say set skia image, and then we're going to put all the images in there. So that should allow us to add our images to the template. Okay, so now that we have that state set up, let's see if we can hook some of it up. Of course, we don't have anything from Skia yet. We only have some basic state we can use, but we can check and make sure that these items are being highlighted as we go. So let's set that to be selected items. And in our pressable, what we're going to do is we're going to do our on item selected. And in here, I'm going to pass the index from the list. So let's reload and see if it works. And cool, as you can see, we are getting these all nice and highlighted. So now back in photos, let's do deletion. This is a bit of a side topic, but I used to always hate in data structures and algorithms when they would show you insertion, which is always the easy part, and they would never show you deletion, which is always the harder way of doing things. So today I'm going to show you deletion. I'm not going to make you do it yourself because that's really painful and annoying. So let's handle what happens when you click on an item a second time and we want to remove it. So basically we're going to say if the item you selected is already in the array, we're going to do something else. So we're going to say const new images is just going to be a copy of these selected images at first. The other thing we're going to do is make a new Skia images, which is going to be a copy of the Skia images that you have now. And I'm copying these because I have to modify them in order to make the changes. So next, we're going to remove the index you just selected from the index array. So we're going to say selected items dot find index. And in here, it obviously gives us back an item. And then we're going to check if that item, which is a number, is equal to the index you just selected. So once we have that index, what we can do is we can say new images dot splice, and then we can remove at the index that we just determined. We can do the same thing for these Skia images. And then just splice it the same way. After that, we set the selected images to be the new images. We set the Skia images to be the new Skia images. Whoops. And after that, we have to fix up the indices of the selected items. So again, we just take the selected items and we filter them. And we do that where the item is not equal to the index, what we just found. Then we can update selected items to be the new indices. Okay, so let's try this out really quick. So if I click some, they highlight. If I click them again, they unhighlight. Okay, that looks like pretty much what we want. Let's move on to the next stage. Okay, guys, so from here forward, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up the navigation and the controls for the editor. The editor is going to be the last thing I do because it's by far the most complicated part of this whole tutorial. In fact, the editor could even be a video just by itself. So from here forward, I'm going to set up everything so that once we get to the editor part, that's all we need to worry about. We don't need to worry about setting up other little stuff. So, okay, let's set up for ourselves a way to navigate to the editor. The way we're going to do that is we're going to switch up this image for a preview of the template. Of course, we don't have the template yet, but for now, I'm just going to replace it with like a black empty image. So we're going to say if the selected item, sorry, let's do Skia. If the Skia image's length is 0, so it's empty, what we're going to do is we're going to show the image. Otherwise, we will show a pressable. And I'm using this 150 for kind of the size of this thing. So I'm actually going to throw this in a constant really quick. Let's call this box size. And then I'm going to put that here. And then, oops. I'm also going to steal that styling for the pressable and make its background color just a black color. So if I click on one of these, you can see I have this black box. And on press, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to navigate to the editor screen. So let's say on press, push, editor. So if I click that, cool, we're navigated to the editor screen. Go into the editor screen here, and let's create some styles. And of course, it's got to come from React Native. So our container now is going to have a style of flex1. And it's also going to have a background color of the background colors that we set earlier. And I got to import that as well. And let's set that here. Cool. Okay, so that's the color that we want. The other thing I want to do is make sure that we don't hit the paddings on the top or hit the safe areas in the top or the bottom of the screen. And in order to fix that, I'm going to grab these safe area insets. So let's say const top, top, bottom equals safe area insets. And what I'm going to do is padding top is going to be this top, and padding bottom is going to be this bottom. So at this point, there's going to be sort of two sections here, like you saw earlier. There's going to be that top section for editing the photos, and then there's going to be that bottom section with the option for all the different like edits and stuff like that. In order to make this work, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a view and call it top section. So style equals styles.top section. And in here, I'm going to add some different styles like flex1. And I'm going to justify content and align items to the center. So what I'm going to do is like use flex1 because that's going to fill most of the space. But for the bottom section of this, I'm going to hard code the height so that it just basically takes up the space that I need it to take up. Now that I've done that, I'm just going to add a temporary background color just so I can know how much space that takes up. And I'm also going to make a bottom section. And the bottom section is going to be pretty similar. But actually, I'm going to give the top section a 1.5 space. And the bottom one a space of 1. So that the top section's bigger and we have more space for the editor. And as you can see, that is the case. All right, so let me get rid of these colors now that we know how much space this takes up. And the thing we're going to do to finish off before we do the editor is we are going to just create a couple action buttons that are going to be at the bottom. And these buttons are going to be used to do sharing, shading, and flipping. So let's create a components folder under editor. And in here, I'm going to create the action button file. And inside here, of course, we're going to do the usual ritual of importing React from React. And I'm also going to import the colors from our colors file, our constants file, I'm sorry. And in here, I'm going to add a new color for the action button. That color is going to be 4D, 4D, 4D. Oops. All right, so back in our action button file, I'm going to make a new type, and I'll call it icon option. And these will just be the options that we specified earlier. You can have a share button, you can have a flip button, or you can have a shade button. I'll also specify the props you can use for it, which are going to be a title, which can just be any string, an on press, which is going to be whatever callback we want. And finally, I'm going to give it an icon option, which is going to be of type icon option. So we also need a method to get the actual icon that we want. And that's going to be based on the icon option that we just specified. And we're going to make a switch statement for that. We're going to switch on the icon type. And when it is the flip, we're going to return the asset for flip. Was it in this level of assets or one higher? Yeah, it was in this level. Okay, flip.png. And then in the shade case, we're going to do the same thing, but return shade. And then we'll do the same thing for the last option, which is share. All right, so let's create the actual component. And in here, we're going to return a pressable. And I'm just going to style this in line just to save time. But for now, let's quickly grab some props from our props. And that's just going to be everything we had there. And so in the pressable, the on press is just going to be the on press. And style wise, I'm going to justify content center, align item center. Our background color is going to be the colors.action button color. Our width is going to be 100. Our margin horizontal is going to be 10. And our gap will be 8. All right, so finally within the pressable, we're going to put an image in there, and that's going to be the icon that we just had. The source is going to be equal to get image, and that's going to be the icon option that we're going to pass into there. The resize mode is going to be equal to contain, and I'm going to give that image a height and width of 25. And did I not import image? I did not. That's why it's yelling at me. And then I also need text. Let's grab text too while we're here. So under here, I'm going to have text. I'm going to throw the title in there. And its color for the text is just going to be white. Very simple. All right, so let's go back and use these. So in the bottom section, I'll have a few different action buttons. For now, the on presses are just going to do nothing. The title is going to be share. And then the last thing I need is the option, which is also share. And let's do the same thing for the other ones as well. So it's going to be shade. Oops, small s. And then flip. And I'm realizing these are vertical, so let me change my orientation here. Flex direction is going to be row. Okay, and I see I've made a couple mistakes here too. Let me quickly go into the action button, and I'm going to give it a height of 100. That's a little better. And I wrote shade twice. So for share, I'm going to make that actually share. Okay, so our buttons are ready and we can navigate. Now it's time for the most interesting, but also the most difficult part of this video, which is creating the video editor. So as I said earlier, this part is probably by far the most complicated section of this entire video that we've done so far. So what I want to do is give a quick conceptual overview of how all of the parts of the editor come together so that you can keep this in mind as we work through the code in a minute. So to begin, we of course have our screen here, right? Which is the editor screen. And we have our buttons at the bottom. And then we have this chunk in the middle that we use for actually editing things. Now this section here is actually not part of the screen. It's its own component. And I'm going to call this component the horizontal template. And so you're probably wondering why I structured things this way, where the template is its own separate piece, separate from the editor. And the reason is because in this video, I really only have the time to show you how to make one template, which is this horizontal one. But I wanted the architecture to be flexible enough where people could bring their own templates, like a vertical template or a square template or whatever else you want to do. And then you could just apply those new templates and put them in the screen and have them just work. Okay, so within the template, we know that we have a couple different sections, right? We have the top, the center, and the middle. So each of these sections has to maintain locations for a few different things. So it has to have an outer rectangle. It also needs to have an inner rectangle. The outer rectangle basically gives this whole thing its shape. And what the inner rectangle does is it helps to control the shader and the image shader that are going to be housed within here. And we need shaders so that, of course, we can apply shaders to the image that look really cool. And this architecture is kind of the best way that we have to do that. So beyond that, we also have our indicator inside here. So depending on whether you tap the top, the middle, or the bottom, this indicator will appear, and the indicator will allow you to resize things. So in order to have all of these rectangles work correctly and the indicator work correctly, we're also going to need to maintain the top position for each of these items. We're going to need to maintain the height of each of these items. And in the case of this one in the middle here, we're also going to need to maintain different values for the middle as well. So the top and the bottom are basically the same in how they work, but the middle we sort of have to cut it in half because the user can either sort of tap the top half or the bottom half, and you want to pull in different directions depending on which half that they touch. So finally, the editor and the horizontal template are going to have to communicate. And the reason is because our buttons here basically initiate different actions on the canvas, like shading and flipping. And so we're going to have an editor provider. And this is going to act as a go-between between these two templates in order to allow the editor to initiate actions on the horizontal template. And also the horizontal template has to be able to share back its base64 value when you want to share it to social networks later on. Okay, so that's everything at a high level, and let's get into the code now. All right, at this point, what we're going to do is we're going to start working on the editor in the middle, as we just described. I'm not going to animate anything right away. I'm just going to get it going statically, and then we're going to move on to make it animated and do all the nice editing transitions and stuff like that. The first thing I want to do before I do that, though, is I want to quickly give it a little space where it can sit on the screen. So inside of the top section, I'm going to create another view, and I'm going to give it a height of 300, a width of 300, and a background color of black. And this is where our editor canvas is going to sit. So at this point, Inside of editor, I'm going to create another folder. Actually, I'm going to need this in other places too. So in components at the top level, I'm going to create a new folder and I'm going to call it templates. And inside the templates, I'm going to put our new one called horizontal images template. So in here, I'll start getting to work by importing React from React. After that, we're going to export const horizontal image template. And then in here for now, what I'm going to do is just return an empty canvas. So we're going to import the canvas from React Native Skia, and then I'm just going to give it a value of flex1. And just to make sure it's showing up, I'm just going to give it a red background color. So let's quickly hook this into the editor and just make sure it's appearing. Okay, that's hooked up. Now we can start doing our other stuff. So now what we're going to want to do is in our constants file, create an interface for the horizontal images template. And we need this so that later on we can actually pass values in that we want. And we're going to call this images template props. And here we're going to have Skia images, which is a Skia image array. We're going to take in a box height, which is a number, Boolean for show editor, because we're also going to need this, of course, for the home screen. And so on the home screen, you never want to show the editor. Finally, we're going to have flipped, which is a Boolean. Okay, so now back in image placeholder, sorry, not image placeholder, horizontal images template, we're going to really quickly wrap this with a forward ref because we're going to need the Skia DOM view later on. So to do that, we're going to say forward ref. First, I'm actually just going to wrap the whole thing and then I'll do the type after. And then we type it out. We want a Skia DOM view and the image is template props. What we're going to want to do is we're going to want to grab everything. So these Skia images, the show editor value, and the box height, which will default to the box size and the constants. And then we'll take in the ref. So for whatever reason, I had some trouble getting the ref to type properly when I was going through this process. So I'm just going to do a quick typecast because I do know that the ref is correct. So we're going to say ref as ref object, and that object's going to be of type Skia DOM view. And the reason we need this ref is because later on we need to take a image snapshot of the canvas, and the only way you can do that is by passing refs. So back in the editor, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create that ref. Sorry, it's not that. It's use canvas ref. There's a better helper for that than what I just used. Use canvas ref is the better one. Okay, so let's pass in the props that are left. So we're going to, of course, need the box height, which is going to be 300. We're then going to need the show editor value, which for now is just going to be true. I'm just going to always show it. Actually, false. I'll turn it off and on later, but for now, we don't need it. And finally, I think that's, the Skia images are also needed. And we're going to have to set that up in a minute. But for now, I'm just going to leave that as an empty array. So if you remember from our whiteboarding discussion earlier, we needed a solution so that we could get communication between the editor and the template. Actually, we also need communication between the home screen as well, because the home screen has to send the photos to the editor, and then the editor has to be able to communicate back to the template. So the way we're going to do that is through a context. So we're going to create a new folder at the global level called context. In here, I'm going to create a file, and I'm going to call it the editor context provider. And actually, I'm just going to copy paste this in. The reason is because context providers are mostly boilerplate that you're writing in here. Really, the only thing you need to remember is that right now in our state, we have the images, we have the images data, and we have the ability to set that data. I'm going to be building this up as we go, and I'm going to be adding like new state. But for now, the only one that really matters is just the images data. Okay, so back in in app.tsx, we're going to wrap the app with that as well. So we're going to say editor context provider. That way it's reachable by everything. And then we're going to go back into the editor. Sorry, not the editor. We're going to go into home. And then for home, we're going to grab the editor context. And from that, we need set image data. And now, before we push the editor, what we're going to do is we're going to set the image data to be the Skia images. Oh, and we have to do images like that because that's what the context provider wants. Okay, that should be all set. The last thing we need to do now to hook up the image data is to go back to the editor, get the editor context, grab the image data, and pass that into here. Images data.images. Okay, so with all that data stuff done, we should be able now to focus just on making the actual template. I'm going to start by making everything kind of static-ish, and then we're going to add a gesture handler to make it animated after. But if you remember from earlier when we did that whiteboarding session, for every section of the 3 sections, we need the top position of the top, middle, bottom, and then we need the height of every section because that's going to be dynamic and adjustable throughout the process. So to get started, we're going to say that the default height of things is going to be the box height divided by 3 because we're going to start with 3 equal sections. That makes sense. After that, we're going to make a shared value, and the top height is going to be the default height. The middle height is going to be the same thing because everything's starting with equal sizes. And finally, the bottom height is going to be exactly the same. So then the middle top border is going to be equal to the default height. And the reason it can be the default height is because the top height, or the top position is 0, 0. So the top height plus the default height is equal to the top of the medium spot. And then for the bottom top border, we can apply the same pattern. The default for that is going to be the default height multiplied by 2. So let's quickly refer back to our diagram that we had earlier. And if you remember, the outer rectangle kind of gives us its shape. And what we just did is kind of give the dimensions of what the outer rectangle is going to be. What we need to do, though, is also create the inner rectangle, which controls the image shader area. And that's what we're going to work on now. And that part can animate as well. So it has to have values that are derived from the shared values that we have here. So let's make our first one. We'll call it first inner rect equals use derived value. And this is going to change every time the top height changes. Here we're going to return x as 0 because the origin will always be the top of the screen. Same thing with y. And our height is going to be the top height value. And then our width is going to just be the box height. And the reason is because the height and the width are kind of always the same. Like this whole thing is a square. So it makes sense for the width to never change. And we're going to do the same thing for the second inner rectangle. But the difference here is that y is going to start at the middle top border. And then the height value is going to be the middle height. which we have tracked. Box height stays the same. And we're going to do the same thing for the third one. But this time, y is going to be the bottom top border. The height is going to be the bottom height. And then that should take care of everything we need there. The last thing we're going to need to do before actually drawing to the screen is getting a little shader program. So I really recommend that you just grab this from my finished project and the links in the description. Usually when you do shaders, you kind of copy them from someone else. You don't generally write your own. In this case, all the shader program does is just takes your image and returns the same image. Later on, we're going to have another shader program that actually shades and changes the look of things. But for now, the nothing source is what we need. Let's keep our structure in mind. We have an outer rectangle, a shader, and an image shader. Up to this point, I've been referring to the inner rectangle as kind of wrapping these. The inner rectangle is actually sort of inside the image shader. It's just kind of helpful to visualize it this way, but in reality, really you're assigning it to the image shader. It's not up top here. So let me do that now, and I'll start adding in the rectangles. So our first rectangle is going to have a height. Oh, I got to import rectangle, which is going to be equal to the top height. It's going to have a width equal to the box height. The x and y will be 0 because that's, of course, just the origin of the canvas itself. Inside the box, I'm going to put our shader there. And for now, the source for the shader is just going to be the nothing source. I'm going to update that later to maybe have a different shader, but for now, that's what we're going to do. Finally, we're going to have our image shader inside of here. And our image shader is going to take in the Skia image at 0. Its fit is going to be equal to cover, because I thought that looked nice. And the rectangle, which is the inner rectangle, is going to be equal to the first inner rectangle. And as you can see, our first part of the puzzle sort of pops up there. So let's repeat that a couple more times. All we need to do is just kind of change the values a little bit. So the height is going to be the middle height. The width is still going to be the box height because it's a square. After that, we are going to say the x is the same because it never changes. And the y is going to be the middle top border. And instead of Skia images at 0, we're going to do Skia images at 1. And it seems like I made a mistake. Oh, this should be the second inner rectangle. And there we go. Now we're at the second part. Let me put the last one in here. And this is going to be the bottom height. This is going to be the bottom top border. Skia images at 2. And this is going to be the third inner rectangle. And there we go. That's our static template. Let's work on making this dynamic and adjustable. But first, we're actually going to do some indicators really quickly so that it's easier to tell which one of these you're adjusting at any given time. All right, so if we look back at our mental model of things, you'll see we have this blue indicator here. This is basically a rectangle that can travel into any given of these thirds of the screen, and it will size itself correctly. It also has two little indicators that I didn't draw here on the top and bottom, just to indicate that you can actually pull down and in which directions you can pull in order to adjust the image. So in order to get this right, what we need to have is the position of the top at any given time, just like we do for anything else. We also need its height, just like we need it for any of these sections. And the reason is because this rectangle, of course, has to mimic the section. Finally, we have a second indicator position, if you're in the middle, basically, that lets you know that you have to put one on the bottom as well as the top. So what we're going to do in this next section here is we're going to start by creating a gesture handler that can detect which section you're in. And based on that, it's going to put this indicator in the correct spot. So to kick things off, let's create the gesture. So we're going to say gesture equals gesture from gesture handler dot pan. And when onBegin kicks off, we're going to get the Y value because that's the only one that's dynamic. X is not. And so we're going to say if the Y value is greater than 0 and the Y value is less than the middle top border value, then we're going to say that the position we're in is going to be the first position. Oh, and actually I forgot to create a shared value for this. So let me do that now. And that's going to start off as 0. And I also need a type for the different positions. So let's say type position. And the different positions are going to be first, second, and third, as well as none for the default value. And that, of course, means the first being the top, second being the middle, third being the bottom, and none being if you haven't selected anything yet. So actually, my position should actually default to none, and we'll make adjustments based on the text after. So next, back in our gesture, we're going to say else if y is greater than the middle top border dot value, and y is less than the bottom top border. Then we're going to say we're in the middle, which is the second. And finally, if it's none of those, we're in the third spot. And actually, just for a little extra type safety here, let's do that. And this is still okay. Good. So let's wrap this with a gesture handler now. Sorry, gesture detector. And then the gesture is going to, of course, be the gesture. Okay, so let's console log this really quickly. And let's make sure that the positions are what we think they should be. Okay, I don't know why it's doing that. So let's restart it. So if I click here, I don't know why I'm getting third for the first position. Oh, it's because I had this reversed. So y is greater than the middle top border. That should fix it. Let's try it out. Yeah, first, second, third. Okay, yeah, because y, if it's greater than 0 and less than the middle, is in the top. So just a quick little flipped sign on my part. Okay, let's move on to positioning the rectangle. I said that you need to know 3 things in order to wrap this. The thing that wraps this, the indicator, is actually just a rectangle. So you need to know its top Y position. We definitely know the X position because it's always the width. And we can steal the height from whether we're in the first, second, or third section. And so we're going to need 3 variables for this. The first one is the color wrapper position. The second one's going to be the indicator wrapper height, which is the top, or sorry, not so much the top, but the default indicator. And then we're going to have a final one called the indicator position, which is the indicator, the second one that can appear if you're in the middle. So let's, oh, I got to do this a little higher because I need my hooks. So we're going to say const color wrapper position. This is the position of the actual rectangle. It's going to be equal to a derived value. And this is going to update based on the position. And here we're going to switch on the position value. And in the case that we're in the first position, we're going to return 0. because we're at the top. In the case that we're in the second position, we're going to return the middle top border.value. And in the case that we're in the third position, we're going to return the bottom top border. And then if it's none, I'm also just going to return 0. Okay, so now we also are going to need the height of the rectangle. This is just the top position of the rectangle. And that's going to be the const indicator height. Also going to be a derived value. And we're going to need a similar switch statement. This time, though, we're going to have the top height.value. We're going to have the middle for the second. And for the bottom, we're going to have the bottom height. Okay, so for the last one, the position of the little indicators. This is also going to need to be a shared value because it's also going to move dynamically. It's going to change based on the top height. I'm going to say if the position value is equal to the first section, or the position value is equal to none, all I'm going to do is just return the color wrapper position, which is the top part, dot value, plus the top height minus 7.5. And 7.5 isn't a magic number. That's actually the height of the indicator that I'm going to give at the bottom in a minute. But it kind of pulls it up so that things are in the middle. But I'm going to say that if you're not either first or none, you're somewhere near the middle. So I'm going to say color wrapper position dot value minus 7.5 is where the indicator needs to be. Okay, so let's actually get one more value. So this indicator is the default indicator. So if you're at the top, it'll give you the bottom little indicator. If you're at the bottom, the thing will appear at the top. But if you're in the middle, it has to appear in both spots. And so that is the middle indicator position. So okay, middle, bottom indicator. Also going to be a derived value. And that's going to come from the indicator position. So here, we're going to say if the position value is the second value. So if we're in the middle, we have to cover this special case. And we're going to say indicator position dot value plus the middle height dot value. Otherwise, what we're going to do is we're going to just basically position this by hiding it under the other one. So we're going to return negative box height. Okay, so let's finish up by actually drawing this thing. So in order to do this, I actually have to switch show editor to true. Because we're going to need to hide it in certain situations, but for now I want to show it. So we're going to say if show editor is true, we're going to create a fragment. That fragment is going to have the rectangle, which is the indicator. And inside there, we're going to say the style is equal to stroke. So if you don't do this, it's going to default to fill, and it's just going to be a block. I just want the outline of the rectangle. I don't want the whole thing. I want the stroke width to be 3. I just thought that was a nice number. The height is going to be the indicator wrapper height. The width is going to be the box height. The X position is going to be equal to 0 because that never actually changes. Y is going to be equal to the color wrapper position that we calculated earlier. And the color is going to be equal to the indicator color, which I'll add in a minute. But for now, let's just say it's blue. And as you can see, At this point, if I click in here, I get everything I want. Let me quickly grab that color though for the indicator because this color looks really ugly. So let's go to the constants. And we're going to make this the color. So that okay, that's way nicer. And now let's pop in our little notches to indicate where we can actually pull. We're going to use rounded rectangles for that. This time I am going to fill it, so I'm not going to say stroke. So actually I don't even need the stroke width. I'm just going to set the height equal to 15. I'm going to set the width equal to 100 because I think it looks nice. These two values are just like kind of random. They just look nice to me. You can set them to whatever you like. Next, for the X position, it's not 0. It is the box height, which is the width. And then I have to pull it towards the middle. So I have to divide by 2. And then I have to subtract the width, which is 100 divided by 2. And that's just 50. Finally, the Y is going to be equal to the indicator position. The color is going to be the indicator color, same as here. And the radius is just something I thought looked nice, which will be a value of 10. And as you can see, when I'm at the top, it appears at the bottom, just like I said earlier. When I'm at the bottom, it appears at the top. It's just when I'm at the middle, I need to have it appear there as well. So I'm going to paste this in. And then what I'm going to do is instead of Y being the indicator position, it's going to be the middle bottom indicator. And so now we get all three indicators when we want them. Can't really adjust anything yet, but the indicators are working and we're ready to start adjusting. Okay, so at this point, what we're going to want to do is move all these different sizes. I'm going to start by doing the top and the bottom because the middle is much more complicated. But once we get that movement, we can work on the bottom. Before I do that, though, I want to do something a little easy. When we finish the gesture, I'm going to need to, you know what, I'll leave that till after. So while the gesture is working, what we're going to need to do is grab a couple values. We're going to need the Y and the change in Y. The change in Y is the change from the previous frame where you moved something. So we're going to say if Y is greater than the middle top border, just like we did before, and Y is less than, sorry, if Y is greater than 0, and Y is less than the middle top border, then we know we're at the top somewhere. And what we're going to do is we're going to adjust the top height dot value and add the change in Y, because the change in Y is going to be positive or negative depending on whether you moved up or down. The middle top border also has to adjust according to what just happened to the top height. The two have to move hand in hand because the top of the middle has to adjust with the height of the top section. Finally, the middle height value also has to adjust along with its border. And that's going to be the middle height value minus the change in Y. Okay, so let's see if that worked. And as you can see, it did work. I am able to drag up and down, depending on whatever I want to do, to resize the image. Okay, so let's work on the bottom now. So for now, actually, I am going to set the else if, just so it does sort of nothing if I'm in the middle. And then I'll have the else take care of the bottom. So for the middle is if you are in the middle top border. If Y is less than the middle top, sorry, Y is greater than the middle top border. And then Y is less than the bottom top border. That puts you in the middle. But like I said, we're going to fill that in later. And instead, what we're going to do is we're going to go down here to the else, and we're going to take care of the logic for the bottom. So we're going to say bottom height value is going to be minus the change in y, because normally you're moving up instead of down. The bottom top border, so this top line, of course, has to change along with that. So that value is going to be plus equal to the change in y. Finally, the middle height, because that has to adjust, because it's also affected by the bottom, is going to be equal to the middle height dot value plus the change in y from the previous frame. Okay, let's try that one out. So now if we're in here, you can see we can move the bottom and we can also move the top, which is great. We just got to work on the middle now. Okay, so like I said, the middle is the most complicated. And the reason is because if you're at the top half of the middle, you want to be able to pull up. If you're at the bottom, you want to pull down, and you don't want that to change until the user lifts their finger. So in order to do that, we actually need another shared value to keep track of this as well. We're going to call this middle pull state, and the states are going to be none if you're not touching anything. They are going to be top if you're at the top, and bottom if you're touching the bottom of that. So now let me create another one, and we're going to call this one middle pull status. And then that's of type middle pull state, and that of course also starts at none. So now on end, we're also going to reset that. So middle pull status equals none. Okay, so now we have to cut the half in half, if that makes sense. So what we're going to say is if y is less than the middle top border dot value plus the middle height dot value divided by 2, and the middle pull status dot value is none. We want to do something. Oh, I need brackets there. Okay. And I know definitely this seems a little weird, right? So what's going on here is this y minus middle border value plus this divided by 2 is giving us the top half of the middle. The reason we're checking for none is just to make sure that this hasn't been set yet. If it has been set, then we are going to change this to top or bottom. So in this case, we're going to say middle pull status dot value is equal to the top. Because of the two halves we created in the middle, these coordinates point to the top half. We're then going to do the same thing here, but change the logic a little bit. So we're going to say if it's greater than or equal to this value, and there's none, so like the pull status hasn't been set yet, we're then going to set it to the bottom, because we're now in the bottom of the two halves. So now we apply similar logic to what we did above. Basically, in the middle pull status, it can be the top, or it can be the bottom. And we got to do slightly different things for each. So for the top, we have to adjust the top height to the change in y. The middle top border, so of the middle section, this also requires the change in y. Finally, the middle height, of course, needs to be adjusted. And that's going to be equal to the middle height value minus the change in y. And so we're going to do similar stuff here. I think it's not close enough to copy paste. I'll just rewrite it. So the bottom height value, because now you're pulling from the bottom, is going to be subtracted from the change in y. The bottom top border will also have to adjust by the same amount, but we're going to add it instead. Finally, of course, we have to adjust the middle height value, and that's going to be equal to the old middle height value minus the change in y. Okay, let's try this out really quickly. And as you can see, we can adjust the middle, and the bottom is a little bit off for some reason. Let's see if we can debug that really quickly. Bottom height value. Oh, I see the mistake. This should be a plus. So if I reload and we try again, you can see that it all adjusts just as you'd expect. And the top, middle, and bottom, we can adjust them all just as you might want to. Now that we have that all working, as a finishing touch here, let's get the preview going up here in the home screen. So back in the home screen, we had this box with the color black on it. And what we'll do is we will throw our horizontal image template here. And for the Skia images, we're going to use the same ones that we have available. For the box height, we're going to use the box size constant that we made. Let me just put these on a new line. And for show editor, we always want that to be false, because when you click on it, you don't want the editor kind of showing. That look kind of weird. And that should take care of that. So now you can see the user can actually get like a live preview as they go. And you can hook this up to as many templates as you want. So you can just kind of jump through there and it'll work. And where's that red really quickly? That's bugging me. I'm going to take that out because it looks really bad. Okay, so now that we got rid of the red, if we click through, you can see that we can actually dynamically add and remove the images as we feel. And if you had more templates, you could have it scroll or something like that, and the user could look through all kinds of them. Okay, so now let's get down to the final fun part, which is being able to apply effects like flips and shaders. And then finally, we'll finish off by actually sharing this. So now that we want to get the effects working, what we need to do is have some method of communicating between the buttons we made down here and also the editor itself. The easiest way to do this with the current project is by using the context provider that we created earlier. So let's add some state here for a couple of modifier functions. Let's call this modifier type, and it's going to have two functions, the first being flip and the second being shade. Now, what we're actually going to want to pass into our context provider is the modifiers, which are going to be of the modifier type, and set modifiers when we want to change them, which is going to be of a set state type. So I'll pull that from there, and it's going to update like this. So I'm going to create another set state for this. It's going to be of type modifier type. We're going to call this modifiers, and then set modifiers. And I'm going to steal flip and shade from here. And they're just going to start off as empty functions, and we'll give them actual like usages a little later on. So let's plug these in here. Whoops, some weird autocomplete there. So now back in the editor, what we can do is in our use editor context, we can pull out the modifiers. And our action button for shade is going to be modifiers.shade. And this is going to be modifiers.flip. Okay, so now that we have the modifiers hooked up, the next thing I want to do is actually create an effect. And the first effect that I'm going to do is shade. So in the horizontal images template, I'm going to start by pulling this shader here from my solution. I recommend you pull it from there as well. The link is in the description. This is just a sample shader to get us going. This isn't a lesson on shaders. Shaders are pretty complicated, so I don't want to go through and write them in this section here. The next thing that we're going to need, though, is the shader state. So which shader is active at any given time. And what that's going to have is it's going to have a checked whether the first is active, the second is active, or the third part is active. And we're going to use this to make decisions about what function is actually going to be used in the modifiers. So I don't know why it doesn't like this use state. Oh, I didn't import it from React. Sure. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to create a function called update modifiers. And this is going to be used to update the modifier functions whenever we actually change what's being highlighted. Again, this communication has to be a little bit bidirectional. So what we're doing is we're giving the editor the function that it needs to perform when a certain section of the template is highlighted. And that'll become a little more obvious in a minute here. So let me quickly pass the position to update modifiers. I'm also going to have a use effect that fires whenever the app, not the app, sorry, whenever this screen renders. And that use effect is going to update the modifiers with whatever the position value is at the start. Then after this, we can hook into our gesture. And inside our gesture, we can do run on JS. And we can call our update modifiers function. And we can call that with the position.value. So if we console log this out, we should see in the update modifiers wherever we are. Let's do that really quickly. So over here, if I click the first, I get first, second, I get second, and the third, I get third. So the update modifiers function is now aware of where we are, and we can now use that to give different callback functions to shade and flip in order to get them to use the right effects. So now inside of the update modifiers function, what we're going to do is we're going to call set modifiers. Oh, and I have to grab set modifiers from our hook really quickly. So inside of set modifiers, what we're going to do is we're going to do dot 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 modifiers. Oh, I also need the modifiers. That's why. So this will do a copy of the old modifiers, and it'll only now overwrite whatever it is I need overwriting. The function that I'm going to overwrite for now, obviously, is shade. And inside of shade, I'm going to say if the position is the first position, what we're going to do is we're going to say set shade state. And that's going to be the old state so that we don't overwrite the whole thing. Of course, we don't want to do that. And the first one is going to be equal to whatever the opposite of the shader state.first is. And of course, we can do this for the second. And the third. So at this point, the shader source is now going to be decided based on that state. So if we go down to our markup, we're going to have to change each of these sources based on that. So what we're going to say is shader state.first. If that's true, we're going to apply the source. Otherwise, we're going to apply the nothing source. The source being, of course, the actual shader, the nothing source being the fake shader that just returns the same thing. And we're going to do that for all of the other ones as well. So we're going to say shader state.second. And then we're going to do that for the third one. Okay, now let's run this and see if it worked. So if I click on one of these and I click shade, oops, there you go. We see it working. I think I might have clicked it a little too fast the last time. Let me just make sure that is working the way I think. And it is, which is pretty cool. And you can also resize the shader, and the shader will dynamically apply. All right, so let's flip it back as well. Cool. So the shader's working exactly as we expect. Okay, so now let's start working on the flipping effect. The flipping effect is more complicated because you have to not only flip it, but you have to dynamically grab the center of each of these images, which is dynamic based on the size. If you don't grab the middle, the image will not update properly. So we're going to need a few derived values for this. It's going to be first transformation origin, and that's going to update based on the top height. I mean, really, they all are. So let me create a few of these. Second origin and the third. Okay, so in the second one, we're going to return a vec. And a vec is just a position on the Skia canvas. And this is going to be the middle of our image. We're going to say box height divided by 2 is going to be the x position. And that's going to be the case actually for all of these. The reason is because the x never changes in this template, only the y position changes. So the y position is where things get a little complicated. For the middle of the first section, we can use the top height divided by 2 because the height is roughly its y position, like at the bottom of that, right? Now to get the center of the middle, we take the middle top border, and we know that this middle top border is the top. We take the height and divide the height by 2 to get the middle. So we say middle height dot value divided by 2. And for the last origin, we can do the same pattern with the bottom. We get the bottom the bottom top bar. We take its height and divide the height by 2 to get the middle. So let's grab that. So we say bottom top border, bottom height, and that should give us that. So at this point, what we're going to do is we're going to quickly plug these origins into all of the different rectangles. So and then second origin, the third origin. So now that that's ready, we need to do another modifier update. This time the update's going to be to the flip. Oh, and actually before we even do that, we need to do one more thing. We need to set the default rotation value. So what you do when you flip is you actually rotate this thing by 180 degrees. 180 degrees in radians is math.pi, and that's what we're going to use today. If you don't understand why that's the case, I have a whole other video on trigonometry you can watch. But today, for now, just trust me, a rotation of math.pi is 180 degrees, and we'll flip it upside down. So what we're going to do for that is we're going to say const first transformation state equals shared value, and that shared value is going to be an object with rotate 0. And there's going to be a second transformation state and a third. So in our flip function now, which we're going to overwrite every time that we have a new modifier, what we're going to do is we're going to say if the position is first, and I'm just going to copy this for second and third. What we're going to do is we're going to say the first transformation state value is going to be equal to the first transformation, first transformation state dot value at 0 dot rotate, and then we're going to check if that's equal to math.pi, because we know if it's equal to math.pi, we've already rotated it and we want to flip it the other way. So if it is math.pi, we are going to change the rotation value to be 0. Otherwise, we're going to change this to be math.pi, which, as we said before, is a 180-degree rotation. Let's do the same for the second transformation value. And then let's do the same for the third. Okay, let's plug these in now to their respective rectangles and see if it worked. Transform equals first transformation state, second, yes sir, and third. Okay, so now if I go back and then I go forward, if I click flip, as you can see, we can flip the image and we can even shade it too, which is pretty good. So we can now both combine flips and shades to get whatever we want. Okay guys, we are right at the end. It's time for the coup de grace, which is creating the share function so that we can share this out to other apps. We're going to do this back in the editor because it's the easiest place to do this. And we're going to say share is an async function. And then inside of here, what we're going to do is we're going to create a quick state that's going to allow us to show and hide the editor functionality. We need to hide it because when we take the snapshot, this blue indicator is going to be in there if we don't set that state. So let's do that really quick. And that will be start that as false. Sorry, true. We want it to be true. So let's put it there. And what we're going to do when we share is we're going to briefly hide it, like I said, so that we can create the snapshot that we want. Next, we're going to use the ref above. We're going to make an image snapshot, which is something that React Native Skia exposes to us. And then we're going to encode base 64. Next, we're going to get our share data. And I'm just going to copy paste this because, like I said before, we always have to prefix our share data with this special little encoding here. Otherwise, the share library is not going to know what to do with it. Finally, what we're going to do is we're going to do share.open. Inside here, we're going to say the URL is going to be our share data. Oh, and actually I have to import that, not from React Native. Let's import share from React Native share. Okay, so we have our URL, which is the image we want to share. Next, we need the title. I'm just going to make that image for now. And we're going to call the message, this is the image I am sharing. And then at the end, we're going to say set show editor should be true. And actually, we need to use a bit of a timeout here just so that the show editor doesn't flash too fast and the screenshot doesn't happen on a weird timing. So we're going to give a little bit of time for the editor to disappear before we go in and we actually take this screenshot. So let's try it out. Let's do all this. We'll shade this. I'll flip the bottom one and then I'll resize a little bit. And if I go to share, it doesn't work because of course I didn't put the share function in the action button. All right, so now if I click share, as you can see, it works and it allows me to share. And now if I save the image and I go to my photos, as you can see, my nicely shaded image ends up here. All right, guys, that's everything. I know that was a long one, but thank you for hanging out and doing this with me. I hope you enjoyed the video and I hope you're able to use this in your own projects. Happy hacking.